Hey guys, I wanted to talk to you about mental fortitude and I guess the things that are tied to it. So basically, tilting, um, not having the mental concentration in a game, like having varying levels of it, having something affect you in a negative way mentally, and then it will affect for the rest of your game. So there's a lot to break down here. So I have a couple of different points that I want to. So I think the biggest misconception and like what people will understand about this is like you're just born with mental fortitude, or just like some people have it and some people don't. I don't agree with that because our brains, sure, we don't know everything about our brains, but you kind of understand the concept of some people are not just going to be born with this like certain mental capacity thing in your head. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not been proven yet, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. So when people say that others have it, it's not like they were just born with it. A lot of times they had to build it up. A lot of times they had to experience failure. A lot of times they had to really work on it. It's not something that's just like, hey, you get it, you don't. You get like 50% of it, you get like 80% of it. It's more so like people have different experiences in their life, so they'll experience different variations of this. So some person might have experienced a lot of physical pain. Maybe they had an injury and stuff, so maybe that helps with their mental fortitude. But maybe like words or like certain actions in a game might actually tilt them in a different way, where someone who has experienced more mental abuse in the past has like got like a bigger barrier for that. And so like the difference is maybe that person's who's gotten the mental excuse or the mental uh abuse, maybe like punching them is like a way to like trigger them and like get them angry and like really tilt them. But then the other person, the way to tilt them is maybe saying like something in a game like, hey, you suck, and that maybe will have the same effect of tilt, but like the opposite might not work for them. So the person who's received like a lot of, maybe it was a boxing, um, maybe he boxed in high school or something, and then he's like super used to like physical pain. So if he has his hand hurt in a game, it's actually not going to mean that much to him because he's experienced it a lot before. He can work through it. So there's different like barriers of like mental fortitude. So for some players it's like different conceptions of it. So some people it's like the choking factor. So we'll take young rosters all the time have choking issues where the players are not very experienced and they potentially are just going to have a high level during the regular season. Then comes the playoffs, they start choking. They're not playing at the same level. So you would say that they're lacking mental fortitude. And then some of the solutions people say are like, just get them a sports psychologist. It's like, I mean, I get where you're coming from. Yes, you want to help them, but it's not just like one guy has all the answers. It's like magic genie. He pops up. He's like, yes, everyone, you just get mental fortitude now. It's not necessarily how it works. A lot of them is like they explain things to them. They explained if you're losing in a game, it's not the end of the world. There's ways to work through it. There's ways to mentally reset in the game. Don't get too tilted. If things start to pop up, there's coping mechanisms. So a lot of them is just like really just getting into the psyche and like explaining things to them. For someone who has like sports experience, so I'd say for like older players, it's not as like as difficult for them. So I would say in my case, I swam a lot and that was a very mental sport. Like sure there's a lot of physicality in it, but whenever you're actually swimming, even if there's a crowd, like I used to swim some tournaments where there was like 1,000 people crowd or something, I couldn't hear any of them, or I could like barely hear them whenever I'm racing. And so it's like super mental. Like sure I might see them as I'm like, because you'd swim and you'd take a breath and you might see them for a little bit, but your brain is not focused on that at all. It's really mental. So like the water's like in your ears. You basically don't hear anything. You basically hear your own thoughts, and a lot of it is like mentally planning during the swim that you're swimming. So if it's a long race, you actually have to pace yourself and you have to count laps, and you can start to get into your own head. So I know like swimmers that I would go against, some of them would be like mentally triggered at like certain parts of the race. And so for me, it was all about just like I need to stay calm. I need to make sure I'm keeping my pace up. If I'm going too slow at a part of the race where I know if I'm going to be swimming for like 5 minutes because the race is going to be very long, I need to make sure, okay, this part of the race I need to make sure I'm keeping my pace up, counting my laps. Sometimes there is a lane counter, but in some instances there's not, and so I'd need to be like counting my laps and make sure I'm not miscounting and like playing with my brain physically. So I'm like making sure my pacing is good, making sure that I'm counting, And I know that some people that would sometimes be like very difficult for them because their brain would wander. It's very hard to stay super focused, especially during this like very difficult race. Sometimes they'll go half the race like way too fast where they won't have anything left in the can to like continue going like as hard as they were for the rest of the race, so they'll burn themselves out. So it's really important to have that mental fortitude. And for someone like me, it was very easy because I spent so long swimming, and so it was a very mental game. So whenever I transitioned into a esports game where there's more talking, there's more focusing, it was very easy for me to like transition and be like, okay, I've been in these situations before where there's been people watching me. It's a pressure situation. I need to perform. Um, Sometimes if it's a different game and there's like different things, so there's different pressures on you. And swimming, sometimes you just feel like physical pain, and that might not transition over to like a mental game where sometimes people are like trying to tilt you, they're trying to like poke at you, they're trying to like really focus you. So it's like a bit different, but you can see how some things can convert over. And so maybe you potentially have a young roster that doesn't have a lot of mental fortitude, and the problem that might like occur from is they're a bunch of young players. All they've really done is maybe potentially play esports games in their room, not really focus on sports or have any like out of the house experiences in front of crowds. They might have not had that same sporting experience where you have to like train as mentally hard. So they might just not have that same experience that a lot of other older players, or maybe players that have like sports experience, have had, where you have different avenues to build that mental fortitude. And not having that can be really hard to train, especially whenever you're like, I'm an adult now, I'm 18, I'm 17. I don't have the same mental fortitude as this 20-year-old who potentially is not as good as me, but in the high pressure game, they can play at 90%, and I tilt down to like 60% of my normal game, so they're going to end up winning even if they aren't as good of a player, but they're able to maintain that same good level that they've been practicing because they have all the experience. And it's really hard for these younger players to really get that experience other than just failing. And then for some of us, we learned like training for years. So for me, like swimming, I trained for years and years. So whenever I got to the point of being like really good, and when there was crowds, I already had the mental fortitude to stay at a really good level. Some of these players are 17, 16, playing on their first stage. They don't really have that same experience, and now they're having to play in front of thousands of people watching online, and they're seeing their first mistakes where they're tilting really hard, and it's like impacting their careers because this is the first time they've ever been in a big competition, and it's really like punishing to them, and they haven't had that same experience of like failing when they were younger and really building off that and learning from it. So they're having to learn at like an older age. It's really hard for them to like actually fail and then like continue to fail and like learn from that, because it's actually super important to fail and then like build up from that. So some of these players, they really just need to fail. It's nothing really against them. I think the players that fail early, and like you've seen some of these teams that like recruit players from like really losing teams, it's actually not as bad, I'd say, to look at those teams and say, hey, maybe we don't focus on the results as much. Maybe let's focus on the good parts of these teams. Some of these players were super mechanical. They look like super bright stars. They had a part of their career that they failed. It was a year ago, and they've probably learned a lot from that, been very motivated, and giving them this chance now to be on like a winning team with a bunch of older players or more experienced players is actually really good. So this is actually bringing up some thoughts on future players that I want to talk about who are like really young but are getting their experience at like a younger age. And so like seeing them transition into like this spot where they can be a pro player for the next couple years, having all the experience earlier on when they're 16, 15, failing, not being as competitive as other players, is like really good to like nurture and bring up young talent. So that's it on the topic. I in the next one, hopefully I can bring up some like younger players that I've seen really fail early on, gain some mental fortitude. Now we can see how they've like transitioned into like really great top pro players over the time that they've been players.